Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of, again, Unit 6, right? We're almost done with this bad boy. We're going to get to move on soon. I'm really, really excited about that because, like I've said before, this is not my favorite unit, but it is a unit that you still need to learn all the same, right? It's about those chaotic, climactic, and really intense 1800s, right? Where a lot of different political stuff is going on. And we left off in class talking about one of those political movements that was actually on the rise, known as socialism, right? And we were talking and defining the socialists and their perspectives and theories even after the revolutions of 1848, but the socialists were around before the revolutions of 1848, in particular one really, really big one that we're about to talk about a lot in this flip, right? But we left off in class talking about people like Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, Karl Marx, right? Talking about how literally socialists are going to be of those educated lower class members, and they're also going to be advocates for them, of course, in the higher classes. They're going to shun the ideas of private property. They're going to encourage a very, very strong government to regulate private property and to use tax money for public benefit, and they want to try and reorganize and redistribute the power, the money, and the means of production, right? And we talked about how Henri de Saint-Simon was a utopian socialist, right? A utopian socialist writer who said that we need to take society away from the parasites, right? People like business owners and people that don't add to society, and give it to the doers like doctors and lawyers and civic personalities and services so they can actually create some different new ideas, right? Now, Henri de Saint-Simon never actually created one of these new communities, but a couple of people did come along and do that, right? Including Robert Owen and Charles Fourier, where they tried to create these communities where this one was, for example, La Avenière, which was in Scotland, right? And the idea was to create an insulated community where there was an 8-hour workday, education for children, marriage would be abolished in Fourier communities, attractive work would be introduced. Robert Owens was in Indiana. Both of these communities failed, but still, Fourier said, literally, and I quote, Fourier said that if we actually achieve the values and ideas of socialism, the seas will fill with lemonade, right? The guy legit thought I don't think he legit thought that. I think it was like a metaphor or something like that, but that the seas would just fill with lemonade, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is that those utopian socialist communities didn't actually work, right? And so a new guy comes along that is going to offer his critique of socialism as it was standing in the 1800s, right? And he believed in a new process to the approach of socialism. He wanted to analyze it scientifically, right? So the thing about it is scientific socialism is an offshoot created by Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx believed and deduced that utopian socialist communities, like the ones that were attempted by Fourier and Robert Owen, were not where they were too lofty of an idea, right? And he said that socialism needed to be studied like capitalism before it, right? So he actually proceeds to try to study the concepts of a socialized government and a socialized idea, and he tries to apply the aggressive scientific study model that people have used to study capitalism and the ideas of gaining wealth and the ideas of businesses existing in a free market society, and he decides to try and analyze that and use those same ideas towards socialism, right? And what ends up happening is he and his friend Friedrich Engels, of course, there's another book that he came out with called Das Kapital, where it actually talks about capitalism and its evils and stuff like that, but he also, him and his buddy Friedrich Engels, end up sitting down and trying to define a socialism that would work. And that text that they wrote, this, by the way, is Karl Marx, looking like the world's worst Santa Claus, and that's Friedrich Engels right there, his buddy and financier, and they're going to sit down and they wrote a book known as the Communist Manifesto, right? And the Communist Manifesto is another word for that scientific socialism, right? Scientific socialism would later on become known as communism, right? Now, the Communist Manifesto was written originally in 1844, but it doesn't become really, really popular until the late 1800s, and the late 1800s are closer to 1888, right? About 40, right around when Karl Marx dies, right? The Communist Manifesto may be one of the most 40 important pages in history. It is a short book. It is a very, very narrow book, right? And it actually talks a lot about heavy ideas that he actually analyzed while he was studying these concepts of capitalism, right? And according to them, according to Marx and Engels, okay, history, we can cook all 40 of those pages down into 5 bullet points, right? And according to him, the class struggle defines history, right? He basically says that if you go back as far as you can in time and you analyze what was going on in history, class struggle has always been a major climactic theme, right? And according to him, there are now 2 main classes that have been exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution and has brought this very much to everyone's attention. And those 2 classes are the proletariat, which is the working class, and the bourgeois, which are the owning class, right? Or the wealthy class. class, okay? And the problem that Marx saw is that the bourgeois control the means of production, right? They use their ownership of the means of production to take advantage of the proletariat, to force them to work long hours for minimal pay, and also there are several other major concepts that he introduces in these 40 pages, right? And when the proletariat becomes aware enough of their plight, what Marx said is destined to happen is a violent communist revolution, right? Where the proletariat will pick up their arms and they will go and attack the bourgeois in a violent revolution where they will basically take the social triangle that was society, right? Remember when we talked about like the social classes and stuff like that being a triangle and the upper class being up at the top and stuff like that, like kind of looking like right here in the corner, that the upper class are here, the middle class and bourgeois occupy those two stances, and the proletariat would be your workers down here. Well, basically, Marx said that in this violent revolution, he was going to end up taking the social calendar and flip it over, right? Where the proletariat would become in charge after their violent revolt. The proletariat would then be in charge of creating a government that would be led by a very strong leader that would then redistribute property and the means of production and then outlaw all the things that like ailed society that fell under capitalism, right? And the idea, though, communism hinges on equality between the sexes, for example, men and women have equal rights in communist societies, equality between all workers, and another key thing as well is the destruction of religion. Marx literally believed that religion in and of itself was one of the worst byproducts of capitalism, and that the wealthy used it to stay in power, the middle class used it to actually kind of have hope, and that it was meant to actually be there to give the poor people an idea to keep them working, right? Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is that communist manifesto will begin its circulation right around 1844, but it does not become extremely popular until 1888. We're going to bring that back up here in a couple of minutes, okay? In a couple of minutes. Now there's one more thing when we're looking at this spectrum, right? We got about our socialists now, talked about our classical liberals now, and we talked about our conservatives as well. But there's one ism that doesn't even exist on the spectrum, right? And it's this one. It's the idea of anarchy or an anarchism, right? And what is anarchy or anarchism? A trend that was growing heavily in the 1800s. It is the concept of no government at all, right? So like the idea that a government in and of itself is a vain attempt at controlling people, and that we need to move away from governments altogether and go into righteous self-rule, right? So anarchy or anarchism was another very large trend that was actually growing, or an ideology that was growing during the 1800s. Now, the thing that the anarchists were best known for, though, was the attempt to destroy the government by means of political assassinations, right? And if you look at this really crazy list right here, like legit, they were doing it a lot. Remember I told you that all the cool kids in like the 1800s were murdering like different like public figures? Like look at all of these attempts to blow up different areas and to assassinate leaders of state. Like y'all, we're talking like these guys were really active and super active all the way up until the 1900s and the 1920s. This list is still going, right? Like so now, the thing about it though is that these anarchists were the ones responsible for trying to stage a lot of these really violent assassinations. And we talked about one of them already, the violent assassination of none other than Tsar Alexander II. Right? And so like now going into it as well though, there was another famous one right here. That is Cecilia, the wife of like Franz Joseph, who was stabbed to death out front of a like theater by an Italian anarchist, right? And there's a lot of other different ones as well. One of the kings of Greece was actually like assassinated by an anarchist, right? But it's just important to know that anarchism is also growing in the background. And there's not really anything more to talk about other than the fact that they believe that governments are suppressive and that we should just get rid of them altogether, right? Now another big interesting thing that's going to be going down in the 1800s is social reform, okay? Yet again, we're going to see another wave of reform that's going to happen on the heels of the Industrial Revolution going into the 1800s. Now, the question is who's getting all of this done? Well, the thing about it is politics are dramatically changing because of the expansion of suffrage and because of the expansion of these social reform movements. So what you're going to end up having is this concept popping up in the mid to late 1800s known as mass-based political parties, okay? So what you're going to see happen basically is that more people gain the right to vote, political parties are going to grow in influence and reputation, right? So to give you an example really quick, you've got the conservatives, right, inside of Britain, and then you also had the Liberal Party inside of Britain, right? Because the thing about it, though, that's now going to end up happening is long before that, you had these people known as like the Tories and the Whigs, and like the Whigs were a little bit more liberal and the Tories were extremely conservative. But things are changing dramatically now in the 1800s. More voters, right, as like time is going on, voting is being extended to more and more people. You also have women out there that are demanding their right to vote. Now, they won't get it until about like 1918 after the First World War, but more voters are demanding the ability to vote, right? And they're expanding the amount of like actual property you have to own to be able to vote, right? And so as this is continually growing, what's going to happen is people who want to get elected to new offices inside the parliaments and things like that are going to have to work harder to appeal to their constituent base, right? And it's going to make these elections more and more intense. So they're going to actually have to make sure that they're actually listening to the people of like the country and going off to the governments and to the parliaments and then also to like the Reichstags later on in Germany and actually getting those things done. And good examples of this include the Liberal Party in Great Britain, the Social Democratic Party in Germany. They are going to actually actively work to create like standardized education systems for children so they can actually have literate populations and also health benefits for the people in their society as well. Now, this is a really great picture that actually is very, very famous. It's that of young Winston Churchill actually walking to the parliament. And when Winston Churchill was extremely young, he actually was what you would consider a liberal, even though he died what you would consider a conservative, right? So going into it, you also have to understand, though, as well, is that these mass-based political parties are also causing a split of socialism, right? So the socialists are looking at the liberals and the conservatives who are now getting entire political parties together that represent their ideas, and they're campaigning against each other, trying to get elected into these offices and affect change, right? Well, socialists, on the other hand, are going to realize, do we get involved in this as well? Should we also have a party? Should we have like a workers' party? Should we have a labor party? Should we actually get involved in this mass-based political party like idea? Well, what's going to happen is socialism is going to begin to kind of fissure away, right? Like, so well, not away from the whole idea in general, but socialism itself is going to begin to split into two ideals, right? And you're going to have two different groups of people. Reform-based socialists who believe that having a political party going out there, getting elected, and effecting change that way will be the most effective. And then you have another group, those are your communists or your Marxists, right? Who believe that voting is worthless and we need to all go pick up guns and armaments and actually just overthrow the bourgeois class, right? So going into it, you have to understand, though, that a lot of this idea of reform-based socialism was inspired by the success of labor unions, right? There were labor unions out there that were beginning to solidify themselves in the 1800s that were demonstrating to the socialists that if you teach workers how to like grind the capital machine to a halt, things will get passed very quickly to help them. And a really good example of this is actually the labor unions that were solidifying themselves in Britain, right, during the 1800s. And the best example of this to try and give you an understanding of how that solidified the idea of reform-based socialism away from the communists and stuff like that, and how the communists are going to begin to become like the extreme side of socialism, where then the other socialists are going to be like, we can get all this done if we just have some elected officials. The best example of this success is going to be this thing known as the Match Girl Strike of 1888. Now, for those of you who are fans of Enola Holmes, the second Enola Holmes movie actually discusses the Match Girl Strike of 1888, right? And really does a good, decent job of actually discussing it as well, because he actually during the movie, it brings up the plight of these young ladies, right? These people known as the match girls, right? Now, these match girls worked inside of factories inside of Bryant and Mays, which was the biggest one in London, where they literally made matches, right? They would make matches out of like stacks of like small pieces of wood. They would get dipped into this chemical. They would then pack them into boxes, and that's what they did for a living. But the thing, and when I say matches, I mean matches like these, like matches like that you take out of a box and you strike it on the side, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is what you have to understand is that these matches at the time were very dangerous because they used a certain chemical, right? The match girls began to demand a lot of different things from the companies that actually they were working for, and the number one thing they wanted to do is to stop having like the use of white phosphorus. Right now, white phosphorus is this stuff that the matches were made out of, the tips of them anyway. And it was causing a disease inside many of the match girls' faces known as phossy jaw, which actually leads to the degradation of your lower jawbone, and it becomes very porous and begins to fall apart. It literally starts to look like this, right? Like literally, you see how it's like falling away and stuff like that? That disease was caused by the inhaling of that stuff that the matches were actually made out of. And they said, hey, let's stop using white phosphorus and let's use red phosphorus instead. Red phosphorus is safe and you don't have to worry about it as much. They also demanded an end to the fine system that was used inside of the factory. Because if any of these young ladies dropped some of these boxes or broke some of their matches on accident, they would then fine some of their pay to try and replace them, which is ridiculous because they would never do that anymore. That's not a fair standard to fine you for doing your job, right? They wanted an end to that fine system. They also wanted somewhere safe to eat. They wanted like a room, like a cafeteria, away from the factory so they could eat away from the fumes of the actual match vats, right? And also they want better pay and they want better conditions, right? They want better conditions for work and they want better pay. And what's going to happen is their strike, their grand, humongous strike that they went on in London is going to get their demands successfully met. And they refused to work and they went on strike in the streets and stuff like that of London. The match companies were forced to bend to their will and they gave them everything they wanted, right? More workers are going to do the same. This is going to inspire the London dock workers strike later on in the 1800s as well. And this demonstrated to the socialists that you can get a lot of stuff done if you just teach people how to go on strike, if you teach them how to advocate for their needs, and if you teach them how to vote in certain officials that will get these things accomplished, right? So that right there is all I got to talk about for today. But I'll see y'all tomorrow. We're going to talk about getting that poop out of the streets in London. All right, so I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.